Kathy, for that kind introduction, and thank you for this award. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you about some of the most recent work going on in our lab, looking at how somatosensory inputs contribute to real-world hand control. And I just wanted to point out that I provided this title to the Society a few months ago, and it's quite serendipitous that this topic about real-world actions has been one of the common themes in many of the sessions we've seen so far today. So it doesn't take me much to introduce this general problem, which is that we're all interested in these kind of naturalistic behaviors, the feats of great skill, either athletic or performance-wise or various kinds of things. But we often study them in the context of lab tasks, which are greatly reduced from that specific situation, right? So while we're interested in cup stacking, we might be studying something like this, where you're reaching between 2 points of light in the dark in the context of some arbitrary mechanical perturbations or external loads or visual motor perturbations. And of course, it's a very powerful paradigm because it provides you experimental control for actually discovering, hopefully, some fundamental features of these real skills that you are interested in. But of course, there's always this question mark that we all have in our head, which is how much do the sort of fundamental things that you discover in the lab actually apply in this real-world situation? And so for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to provide you a way that I've been thinking about this, which is rather than motivating questions by these complex skills, it's to step back and take a thought about what are the simplest, interesting tasks that one could study. And so the idea here is that rather than making this large leap between naturalism and experimental control, you're going to try to bring those two things together. And of course, you lose things in that process. You lose the sophistication of the kinds of tasks you can study, but you gain things as well, which is the ability or the hopefulness that the things that you learn in the lab really generalize, at least to those little nuggets. And I'm not the first person by any means to think of this. This is something that many of you in the audience are already doing, and one great example of this, in my opinion, is the work that's involving this very simple task, which is the lifting of an object from a surface. This is obviously a real-world behavior, and it's a nugget within many more complex real-world behaviors. But the beauty of studying this kind of task is that you can basically exert very strong experimental control over it, and you can parameterize it in a way that it's parameterized in the real world in the lab setting. And this has been an exceptionally successful paradigm over the last 30, 40 years to understand this particular behavior, but also the underlying neural mechanisms. And so for the rest of the talk, I'm going to give you some examples of both recent and current and ongoing work in my lab and in collaboration with others that has taken this approach, just to give you three vignettes of how we apply this, how we're applying this currently. So in the first part of the talk, I'm going to discuss the tactile guidance of the hand. And the behavior here we're interested in is exemplified by this lady here. So she's picking blueberries from this branch, or some kind of berry from this branch. And she's not looking at it, but she's grasping the branch that she's holding. And so to guide her other hand to pick off those berries, she really has to rely on somatosensory cues, both from the limb, but especially from the glamorous skin of the hand. That information from these hands is really giving her some cues about where those berries lie so she can continue the actions that she's doing. And so this kind of question related to how is the human hand guided is a really a notable area of research when it comes to visual guidance of the hand. And this is a very elegant classic study by Day and Leon in 2000, but there's been many versions of this experiment where the participants reaching from a central target usually to a central location here that's like an LED, and sometimes that LED jumps over here and jumps over there unpredictably to the participant. And when this happens, the person makes the reach to the correct target. But critically, they do that really quickly. They do it more quickly than you would expect from sort of standard measures of voluntary reaction time. And you can see that here, so 0, this line here is when the target jumps. And you start to see deviations to the new target location, either to the left or to the right, at about 125 milliseconds as measured by some measure of the hand velocity. Now, interestingly, this is a relatively automatic process because if you change the task for the individual, you tell them when it jumps left, you do sort of an anti-reaching task, you move right, and if it jumps right, you move left. Then you see the following phenomenon, which is that the initial response of the arm is still pulled to where the actual visual target is. So there's some kind of relatively automatic system that's dragging the hand to that visual cue. And sometime later, some less automatic system, some higher order system can kick in and override that. And really in this simple experiment, what we're going to test is whether or not this is really a special feature. Is this really an automatic pilot for vision? Or is this applied to touch as well? Is it more of a generic system for other modalities? So we brought this task into the real world, or from the real world into the lab with this following stick and ping pong ball gadget. And so basically the task is the person has a start position here where they rest their finger. There's a tracker that's tracking their finger position. And their other hand is here on a surface that has an embossed edge upon it. That embossed edge is co-aligned with the stick, basically. So it provides information about where that ping pong ball is in space. And they're going to do the exact same day in Leon study. Sometimes they're going to do that in this domain with no vision. Their vision is occluded. Or sometimes they're not going to touch and they're going to see everything and they'll just repeat the day in Leon study. And it's the exact same setup. Usually it doesn't jump, sometimes it jumps. In this case it jumps to one of 4 possible locations. Not to belabor this too much, so here are the kinematics for this task. They start to reach, the target jumps, they make these deviations. Here the solid lines are the tactile condition and the dashed lines are the visual condition. And you can see that they look roughly similar in their corrective actions. In terms of the position signal, the deviations here are about 150 milliseconds, but if I were to show you the derivative here, the tangential velocity would be just like the day in Leon study. And just to give you another view on this, here I'm just comparing side-by-side EMG responses from shoulder muscles that are actually the muscles that are the prime movers moving towards those final goal targets. And what you can see here is that both the tactile and visual responses are engaged for the corrective actions at about 75 milliseconds for touch, a little tiny bit later for vision perhaps. They both are appropriate for the target direction and they both scale with the magnitude. Now you can definitely see a difference between vision and touch. I mean, the vision has a higher gain on this response, it's more robust. But I should point out that we made no effort to sort of normalize the salience of these cues, right? So it could just be that the tactile cue we use is just weaker, and had we selected a bigger edge or a different edge, maybe this would have been ramped up. But the key point here is that conceptually, these fast muscle responses are there for both modalities. There's more details in the paper really showing the similarity between the visual and tactile system, but where this is going in the lab currently now is to go into the monkey lab, to go into my monkey lab and try to discover whether there is, or working under the hypothesis that there's a common brainstem pathway for keeping the hand on target, specifically tectospinal projections that might govern these kind of fast corrective actions, both for the visual modality and the tactile one. And in there's a lot of interesting questions about how they interact and how they work together in real-world behaviors where often you have both of these things at the same time. So in the second part of the talk, I'm going to discuss another task that we're very interested in, which relates to tactile acuity, it relates to these kinds of behaviors. Which is simple things like putting that little hook onto this jewelry clasp and closing it. Now, this of course is an interesting task because it really pushes the spatial tactile acuity that's required, right? So the problem with this task is that, of course, sometimes you have vision. He's looking at this in this particular location, but the actual location where you're manipulating the object is going to be often occluded by the fingers themselves, right? And moreover, this kind of task can often be done without vision explicitly, like as you're putting on that piece of jewelry behind your neck. And so this raises the question about what are the limits of tactile acuity during hand control. And this is interesting because if you go into the literature and say what's known about tactile acuity, you're going to stumble among dozens of papers for many independent research groups that are trying to assay tactile acuity in the context of perceptual or psychophysical tasks. And there's a whole range of these tasks. It can be match to sample, to alternative forced choice. There's all ways you can parameterize these tasks. And all of these studies, including ones in our own lab, arrive at sort of tactile acuity in the perceptual domain in the order of 20 degrees accuracy. Now if you think about that, you say, how is 20-degree accuracy going to support that fine manipulative behavior that we just showed in that video? And the short answer is hard to believe that that can really be the case during control. And of course there are situations where there are just fundamental differences between perceptual attributes and things during control. You can think about the visual stream, the dorsal and ventral visual streams, for example. And so we just decided to build a gadget to test directly what is the limits of tactile acuity, what is tactile acuity actually during control. And so the gadget looks like this. It's like a protractor, a little dial and a stick pointing out again. And the person's finger is resting on a start location, and they reach down and touch this dial, and on the dial again is one of these edges. I'm going to focus here on an edge that we call the infinite edge, which just means it's an edge that spans the entire fingertip. It's infinite relative to the fingertip. But we also parameterize the length of the edge. I'm not going to go into that. You can check out the paper that's just been published in Eli on this. And so you can see that the person's going to reach down, they're going to get some contaneous cues about where this pointer is pointing, and then they're going to rotate that dial towards a particular goal location. In this case, the goal location is straight ahead or 0 degrees. And so here we have sort of a control task. You can think of that dial and pointer as some kind of object that the person is manipulating. I'm just going to show you a video of what this task looks like in practice. So the point I want to emphasize here is that this is a really easy task for the people to do. They do it immediately, and it's not like we're hurrying the person along. They can basically choose their own, go at their own pace. There are some ultimate limits where this thing will buzz at them if they just don't do anything, but it hardly ever occurs, and they're not in any really kind of time pressure to perform. I'm just going to show you a little bit of the kinematics and behavior that's actually going on in this task. And so here you can see that these 6 trials where the dial is oriented to one of these particular locations, 30 degrees, 20, 10, I just chose these as examples. And the person's job is to bring them into this target zone, which is plus minus 2 degrees relative to the target. And what you can see is that and also I should have mentioned, we have a force transducer that's under that dial, so we can actually measure the contact forces that the person's exerting. And we have a tachometer that we're able to measure the rotational velocity and a potentiometer to measure the position. And the idea here is just very simple. What I want to draw your attention to is 2 features here. One is that they do this task, or 3 features. 2 is that they actually start to move. So this is the rotational velocity. They're moving relatively quickly. I'll get back to this detail. In fact, they're moving before they even get to their steady state contact forces. This is natural for them to do. They didn't have to do this. They weren't rushed in a way that forced this. This is just what they do. And the other feature to point out is occasionally they make multiple sub-movements. So before they get to the goal, they might get here and then make a secondary movement. You can see this with these multi-peak velocity profiles. That's going to come back up in an analysis in a few slides. So just cutting to the chase on this point, we say, well, what is the acuity during control? How well do they orient this dial relative to the goal state? And so here are the results on that. Again, I'm going to focus here initially on the infinite edge, because that's the one that's directly comparable to the perceptual studies that I described. And so here you can say, you just look at how well participants orient the edge in hand control. They're well down here below 3 degrees on average. And each gray line here is an individual participant. This is a very robust effect across everybody. I don't have time to get into details. And over here on the right, I'm just showing you what that looks like in practice. For these shorter edges, there's I don't know if you can see, but there's a black thing and there's a red thing. The black thing is just to orient you to some particular location. The red thing is the deviation, the angular deviation that they're able to robustly extract for this kind of control task, right? So I mean, in practice, this is a very small difference that they are able to take advantage of. There's another analysis we do in the paper where we actually take advantage of this fact of permuting these edge lengths, right? So we say, okay, they can do this with the infinite edge, but how short does the edge have to get? How little information can they get before they lose the ability to correctly orient this device? And I don't have time to go through it here, but it turns out that they have above chance performance for edges somewhere between 1.5 to 2.5 millimeters in length. That's an incredibly short length, and it turns out that it's also at the limits of the jewelry pieces that you buy in the store. So they would the jewelers would love to make the jewelry pieces even smaller, because the jewelry pieces are the ugliest part of the jewelry, but they're limited, and maybe perhaps limited by this constraint, the kind of useful edge information that one can actually extract to put that piece on. And I just wanted to point out in passing that we can also benchmark the touch, not just benchmark the touch against the previous psychophysical experiments, we can benchmark the touch against visual information in the exact same task. So now instead of having any edge on that little dial that you touch, just remove the edge and show them the protractor, show them everything. And what you can see is they do better. They get about 2 degrees accuracy But the incremental difference from that tactile information to the visual information is really small. It's certainly much smaller than previous descriptions about the advantages of spatial acuity of the visual system. I don't have too much time to go over this point, but just to say that it's not just the system is acute, it's the system is incredibly fast. And so here again, I'm just showing you what I pointed out qualitatively in words, that people start to rotate the dial around 200 milliseconds after they touch it. And they do that even before they reach their sort of steady state contact force. And here what I'm showing you is analysis that tries to get at whether or not they've got all the information about edge orientation that they care about at that moment in time. And so here we leverage the fact that sometimes they make sub-movements. And we take all those trials where there exist sub-movements and separate them from trials where we can't register a sub-movement. And then we ask the question, are they more accurate on those trials? Presumably, if the sub-movement has taken advantage of additional information that it's acquired over time, then it would be useful for them in terms of getting that pointer closer to the target. But that's not the case. So whatever those sub-movements are, they're completely random relative to the, or I don't say completely random, but they're random relative to the goal target state. This is one piece of evidence amongst a few that they've really extracted all that information in those first few hundred milliseconds. And that's consistent with what we know about how these tactile efforts respond. They have this very strong dynamic response, and really once the things are in steady state, they're not providing much information anymore. So that dynamic phase is really what drives your ability to not just accurately, but quickly extract tactile information during touch. Now, or edge orientation information during hand control, I should say. So the final point here, which I don't have time to go into, but I think is something we're thinking about a lot in the lab, is getting at the neuromechanisms, again going back to the monkey lab, and trying to understand why is it the case that you have differences for perception and action. And the reason, one idea that we're playing a lot with is that the first order tactile neurons multiplex information both in rate codes and in coincidence codes. Meaning that the rate code, sort of some measure of intensity, is being read out by whatever system is providing you perceptual judgments, and another system that's actually engaged in the online control of the hand is using coincidence codes to extract that information. We have some ideas about where in the nervous system this might be occurring and the kind of features you would look for, the biophysical features you would look for in the kinds of neurons to perform this kind of extraction. And I should say in passing that key to this idea is the fact that the periphery has a particularly complex organization in terms of how first-order tactile neurons innervate the skin. I can't get into that, but these papers here, both the Eli paper and the older paper that I had with Roland, describe that concept a little more mechanistically. Okay, so the third and sort of final area of research that we're interested in is really going back to sort of my roots in neuroscience. I've been studying this since I first started, since 2004, and it's basically going after this idea of the relative sophistication of reflex response. And I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. Specifically, the idea that the spinal stretch reflex is dumb compared to the longer latency reflexes, which at least partially transit the cortex. And so to give you an example of one experiment where this is patently true, that the spinal reflexes in fact often are dumb, is the following scenario. So if you, and this is from my work, but this particular experiment has probably been done 100 times, 100 papers on it. So the basic idea here is you stretch a muscle, and you tell the participant how to respond to that stretch. You instruct them either with words or with some spatial tasks. There's many ways of doing this, how to respond to that stretch. And the simplest thing you can do is give them two sort of extreme examples. One is to tell them to resist the perturbation, and the second is to tell them to relax after the perturbation, or to not intervene. This is a very famous instruction. It's shockingly robust. It's actually a really cool phenomenon. And what you see in that scenario is you evoke phasic muscle activity that has these various peaks. So you evoke this little blip of activity between 20 and 45 or 20 and 50 milliseconds. And this is what people call the short latency stretch reflex. And it's undoubtedly spinal because of its latency. And then later you get this thing here, which people call the long latency stretch reflex. And this thing has multiple neural contributors, including a transcortical feedback pathway, which is some work that many people have done over the years, starting from Everts to Ed Fetz, and including me when I was in Steve's lab, to really establish that there is a transcortical contribution to this wave of muscle activation. And what you see here then is that you evoke these responses, but they are categorically different as a function of what you told the person. Specifically, the spinal one does nothing to the instruction. It doesn't take that instruction into account at all. It's a slave to some inputs in this domain. But in contrast, this longer one is really dramatically modulated according to the task at hand. So the idea here is that the difference, why is this able to do this and this is not able to? Well, the simple story is that this invokes cortical machinery, the same kind of cortical machinery that contributes to the voluntary control of movement, which is clearly able to be manipulated according to these kind of instructions and many, many other things. This is just one example. There's dozens of experimental paradigms that follow the same flavor, that being that there's some function, and that function is not evident in the spinal stretch reflex, but is evident in the transcortical one. And this has been summarized recently by this figure that Steve Scott published. I mean, I could have just as well published this too, because I would buy into this at some level, right? Is that the idea here is that there's a bunch of functional capacities that the reflexes are able to execute. He sort of cartoonized them as like what, how, and where. And these reflexes flow through these computations, but critically, notice that the spinal cord is sitting completely outside these boxes, right? So all of the sophistication, all the kinds of smart responses are attributed to these transcortical or long latency stretch reflexes. And what the spinal cord is doing here is, he doesn't even make it clear, but the implication is the textbook implication, which is just controlling local muscle length, which is still a very useful function, but not particularly sophisticated in terms of the other context that it might be placed within. But this is a really surprising result when you think about it, because there's plenty of other spinal reflexes that are incredibly sophisticated. We have a whole session about this, but one particular example here is the so-called flexor and crossed extensor reflex. If there's a noxious stimulus, if you step on a pin with one foot, you'll have a flexor reflex to withdraw that particular foot, and simultaneously you'll extend the opposite leg to bear the load of the body. It's incredibly sophisticated and very useful, right? I mean, you remove that noxious stimulus, and it requires some coordination, not just across muscles, but across limbs. So, and this is entirely done by spinal circuitry across various segments. So it's not that the spinal reflexes can't do things, but we haven't seen any evidence that the spinal stretch reflexes are particularly sophisticated. And so the idea is maybe we've just been looking in the wrong places. Maybe the reason we haven't found it is we haven't brought the right task to the table. We haven't discovered the modules within the spinal cord that grab onto the sophisticated machinery there in the spinal stretch reflex. And what I'm going to show you now is some work by Jeff Weiler, a postdoc in my lab, with whom we stumbled in on one situation where the spinal stretch reflex is incredibly sophisticated. We're very excited about this result, and I just point out that Jeff has a poster on this topic in this session, and encourage you to go chat with him to get your questions answered. So let me describe the task. So Jeff had the participants sit in a robot, which is a 3-degree of freedom robot in the horizontal plane. This is a robot that Paul Gribble had built, and it's a great device for these kind of experiments. And so the task for the participant is very simple. It's postural control. Keep your hand on that target. Now what Jeff did was he designed a really elegant experiment where he dissociated the local muscle stretch of, in this case, I'm going to talk about the triceps muscle, from the global goal of the task, which is how far the hand moves from the target. And it works as follows. You always apply the same elbow flexion torque to stretch the triceps muscle, and you apply one of 3 wrist torques, okay? In this case, I'm just going to focus on 2, either flexion or extension. And it turns out that when you do this, in the situation where you couple the elbow flexion torque with the wrist extension torque, you get the most elbow motion. You stretch the triceps the most, but you move the hand the least relative to the target, because you get this counter roll of the wrist. And the opposite is true over here, right? So here you get the least elbow motion, but you move the hand furthest from the target. And now you've sort of separated these 2 things out, and you can ask, what does the stretch reflex respond to? Does it respond to the local dumping, the local muscle stretch, which would be the prediction from that previous review article I mentioned, and all the previous work? Or does it somehow integrate information across these joints and understand the goal of this task to bring the hand back to the target, in which case it should show a different pattern? And it turns out that in this context, the spinal stretch reflex is not dumb at all. It's actually showing a quite sophisticated pattern of activity. It's not responding to the local triceps. This is the triceps muscle. It's stretched the most for this blue trace, but it actually is even inhibited in that situation. It's stretched the least in this green case, but responds presumably because that's the situation where the hand is furthest from the target. This is an incredibly robust result. It's the most robust result I've ever seen with reflex responses. This is every individual participant, the gray lines, quantifying the magnitude of those responses in that stretch reflex epoch. So that was really cool. So the spinal stretch reflex is not dumb, and you can understand this pattern of results because there are heteronymous connections from wrist afferents to elbow muscle motor neurons. What this result does is really important. It actually attributes a function to those heteronymous connections for the first time. But Jeff didn't stop there. He then devised the following experiment, which is, he said, well, what's cool about this setup is that the wrist can be either upright or flipped. And what this does is it categorically switches the mapping between local joint motion and the task. So while in the upright condition, the wrist flexion condition is the one that causes you to move furthest, that's completely opposite here. And we again asked, does the stretch reflex now account for that switch in information, which requires an additional level of computation at the spinal level to know which afferents should I grab from as a function of this configuration. Without belaboring this point any further, the results are exceptionally clear that indeed it does. So it accounts not just for the local joint motion, it also is appropriately responding to this overall orientation of the limb. So just show that very quickly here. So this is a situation where you have the same local wrist flexion, and either the hand is upright, in which case the hand moves far from the target, and then you evoke this excitatory spinal stretch reflex. But if you flip it and apply the same local wrist flexion motion, now your hand is close to the target, and actually you see no spinal stretch reflex or actually a reduction. And the same is true for wrist extension, and again, it's incredibly robust across individual participants. So this is the last slide to say we're very excited about this result because we think what we've done is revealed a functional module within the spinal cord. And so you say, well, what would that actually look like in terms of the neural basis? And one potential possibility is that you have selective presynaptic inhibition onto the triceps motor neurons that generate these reflex responses. And the selectivity comes from that orientation of the limb. So this is a cartoon circuit that I don't have time to get into, but needless to say, we're really curious about investigating this in animal models. Maybe it would require spinal recordings in a monkey, which maybe if Dr. Secchi is here, we could talk about. But otherwise, maybe in simpler creatures as well, if they show this behavior. So this is my final slide, just to wrap this talk up, to say that, look, what we're really interested is, we're all really interested in this. We want to understand real-world skills, and we want to study in the lab. But in practice, what we often do, and me included, is we take those real-world skills and we try to extract some nuggets out of them. So we build a task that's actually looking at lab nuggets, some nuggets of the control that we think are really important. And then we have this issue of generalizing back to real-world skills. The approach that I'm currently working under, and I think can hold some traction in the short term, is instead of living with this, what you can do is just admit that you're studying real-world nuggets, and study those real-world nuggets in the lab as best as you can. And this has some costs. But I think together, the idea isn't that everybody should do this or everybody should do that. We need to invest in both of these approaches, a spectrum of those approaches, and learn how to transfer between them. And so I just wanted to thank all the people that have contributed to this work, in particular for the science I was showing here today, Roland Johansson, Randy Flanagan, and Jeff Weiler. Thanks very much.